So I first heard Benjamin Percy right here at this very book festival 2 years ago. His voice so deep and resonant, it seemed to come from the very earth itself. I sat up just a little bit straighter to listen to what this man had to say. At the time, he was promoting his book, Red Moon, a wild ride of a thriller about werewolves, discrimination, and acts of terror. I was hooked. This sounded like my kind of book. And I was right. I loved the book so much I bought it 3 times. A digital copy for my e-reader, a hardback for the shelf, and the audio version because once you hear Ben speak, you will truly understand why. One of the scariest things I've ever heard is Benjamin Percy reading the children's classic, Goodnight Moon. Do yourself a favor and do a Google search for this when you get home. Just keep the lights on because you will be terrified. Now, I'm a big nerd, and it's okay because I wear the badge proudly. So part of my nerd behavior is when I like something, I really like something. And I really like Benjamin Percy's writing. So after reading Red Moon, I bought and devoured his other books, The Language of Elk, The Wilding, and Refresh, Refresh. I had a serious nerdgasm when I learned he was writing a 2-issue Batman story arc for DC's Detective Comics. Comic book arcs are usually 5 to 6 issue long to fit the graphic novel format. Ben wrote a story so big in 2 issues, it blew away many of those bloated 6-issue arcs. Also, more good news for you comic book fans like me, Ben is taking over the writing of Green Arrow for DC Comics starting next month. Yeah, I'm pretty excited about that as well. Ben was born in Oregon and now resides in Minnesota with his family. His work has been read on NPR and published by Esquire, GQ, Time, Men's Journals, magazines, just to name a few. Some of his honors include a fellowship from the National Endowment of the Arts, the Whiting Writers Award, 2 Pushcart Prizes, and the Plimpton Prize. His new thriller, The Deadlands, is a post-apocalyptic reimagining of the Lewis and Clark saga. I just recently finished the book, and all I can say is, wow. I won't say too much about the book as Ben is here to tell you all about it. However, I will say that you will never think of bats in the same way ever again. Terrifying in the best possible way. Even Stephen King, the master of the thriller genre, said, "Good God, what a tale, don't miss it." So without further ado, please welcome Benjamin Percy.
Hey everybody, thanks for coming out today, and thanks to Stephen for that very generous introduction. I appreciate your support so much. So my childhood can only be described as pre-apocalyptic. I grew up in Oregon on 27 acres of big pines, and my parents were, for a time, back to the landers. So all of the meat that we ate was harvested by my father. And I grew up on a diet of elk, venison, and bear. That's why I sound like this. Steady diet of bear. And we had our vegetable patch and our fruit trees, our chicken coop, our cow. And I'm not exaggerating when I say that every weekend we would fill the pickup truck with rifles, fishing rods, pickaxes, shovels, and we would head off to some dry canyon or some mountainside. And we would not only be fishing and hiking and hunting and camping, but rock hounding. My dad is an amateur geologist, and every corner of their house to this day sparkles like a museum. And his prized possession is this deer skull encased in rose crystals that he pulled out of a grotto, and he keeps it in the center of the dining room table like a sugared ham. So this is how I grew up. I grew up going to survivor camp. So the first night of survivor camp, I wake up to screaming. The counselor's asking what's going on. Flashlights are swirling all around us. It turns out that the kid in the bunk below mine has been bitten all over by black widow spiders. An hour later, a chopper came in because we're in the middle of nowhere. Took him away, and he was never seen again. Day 2. Some kid who was allergic to eggs ate eggs. And he started to rash out and hive up and wheeze. An hour later, the chopper returned. And I can remember this gauntlet of children. We were all staring as hup, 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 the EMTs carried him away, gasping for breath. He too was never seen again. Day 3, we had to make atlatls. Maybe you're familiar with atlatls. They're what you chuck tennis balls to your dog with at the park these days, but they're a spear chucking mechanism originally. So we had to make atlatls. We had to shave down the sticks. We had to connect the ligature. We had to even use deer antlers to chip the obsidian into projectile points and shredded our hands in the process. And then, of course, some kid hurls an atlatl spear right into another kid's leg. The chopper must have been busy that day because he was taken away by van. Day 4, we had to build shelters. I have no idea where the counselors were during all of this, but we were taken out into the middle of nowhere and abandoned, and we had to build these shelters, and there were gullies there, and so we thought, this would be a good place to build a shelter in the shade, protected from the wind. So we collected the dried wigs of sagebrush. We collected all of these brittle sticks and made a shelter, and we were sleeping in it, and a storm came that night. And the gully filled with water. And everyone was swept away. In the end, there was only me. So this is how I grew up. And maybe because of this, falling off the grid has always been an active part of my fantasy life. And this has only been encouraged by the books I've loved my whole life. Books like The Stand by Stephen King. Books like Swan Song by Robert R. McCammon. You don't hear much about Robert R. McCammon anymore, but for a time there, he was right up there with Dean Koontz and Stephen King and Anne Rice as one of the dominant horror storytellers. And Swan Song is fantastic. I love Ridley Walker, Canticle for Leibovitz, Fiscadoro, Oryx and Crake, The Road. I'm in love with the Journals of Lewis and Clark. I was given the Journals of Lewis and Clark when I was 12 years old by my mother. And if my father is an amateur geologist, she is an amateur historian. And she gave me the Journals of Lewis and Clark inscribed with the message, "Seek adventure." And on all of those weekend expeditions I was telling you about, we would always, it seemed, stop along the Lewis and Clark Trail. And she would lecture us endlessly. It seemed like endlessly because I was 9, I was 12, I was 16. And she would lecture us endlessly about how this was the greatest adventure story in American history. And I always wanted to write about Lewis and Clark. Initially, I thought maybe I would do a nonfiction account of their journey, that I would recreate the passage, that I would bring different people from my life, friends, family members with me along different legs of the journey, and also make it about my upbringing, which was very Huck Finish. And I don't know how, but my wife somehow didn't know about this, as it became bundled with a publishing deal. And she said, hold on a second, let's figure this out. We sat down and looked at the numbers and how long it would take. I'd be on the road for probably 3 to 4 months, and we have 2 young kids. And she very reasonably said, that ain't happening. So I thought maybe a historical novel would be a good idea, but that's been done. And so this post-apocalyptic lens seemed like a way to make it relevant once more. Seemed to make a way to make the journey perilous once more. I mean, if you think about the history of the situation, here you have Louisiana, this vast territory that everybody coveted. You had Britain, Russia, France, America, all wanting this territory. Napoleon sells it to Jefferson for $15 million, and in doing so, doubles the size of our country. And nobody knew what was out there. I should say, no white people knew what was out there. And as a result of this, they were pondering whether woolly mammoths might be wandering about. And if you just imagine the guts it would take to head off on an expedition like this, it was the equivalent of heading off for the moon. And so, these untold wonders that await, these untold horrors, I was able to tap into that mindset once more when writing about this post-apocalyptic environment, this infant nation. So, for starters, I thought I might read to you about how the world ends. Seems hard to believe on a sunny, friendly day such as this. But the end is nigh. No one knows where the flu came from. Some say a long black car pulled up to a gas station, and from it stepped a black-haired man in a black suit who coughed once into his fist and gripped the pump and muddied it with his phlegm. Others say that late one night, for a few minutes, all over the town of Ames, Iowa, The faucets ran yellow and as thick as melted wax, polluted by a terrorist, or maybe some parasite loosed from deep beneath the earth. And still others say that a featherless crow, the size of a child, tumbled down a chimney and onto a fire that charred it into a black pile of bones and sent a disease cloud into the air all over town, one that people breathed into the pink pit of their lungs, where a burning sensation gave rise to a cough. That is how the sickness began, with a cough. A needling itch at the back of your throat that grew steadily worse until it felt like your chest was clogged with burrowing ants that you simply must expel, barking raggedly into your hands until they were spotted with blood. Accompanying this was a fever so powerful that a wet washcloth steamed when placed on your forehead. Your brain cooked. Your vision went red, with twirling black flies along the edges, and all this time, you were coughing, until it felt as though your guts might uproot. Ames, Iowa is a good place for the world to end. I don't know if you know much about Ames, Iowa, but it is home to the USDA labs. And the USDA labs are level 4 security clearance, and every nasty thing imaginable is encased there. And you have guys with assault rifles walking around the grounds. You have 3 levels of barbed wire. You have also, very curiously, it's this vast building, and it's out in the middle of nowhere, and then right across the street is a daycare. And Crow's winter in Ames, Iowa, is very Hitchcockian. Thousands and thousands of crows come there for the winter. And on the grounds of the USDA labs, they have all of these animals that are being experimented on. You know, they're shoving things into their diseases into their brains and seeing what happens. And then here are these crows that land upon the fields, and then they fly up and they land upon the teeter-totter across the street. Some zombie toddlers are going to be wandering out of there. So I worked out with some of these guys, and I was always wondering, have you washed your hands today? I lived in Iowa for 4 years, and I was glad to escape it. So that's how the world ends. But the way the world ends is almost irrelevant. The opening epigraph comes from Neil Gaiman. I say opening epigraph because I have several sections. Each one has its own epigraph. And the opening epigraph comes from Neil Gaiman, and it reads, "All stories are in conversation with other stories." And I could rant for a long time about why I use this. But when it comes to the way the world ends, we're so familiar with post-apocalyptic and apocalyptic narratives at this point. Post-apocalyptic fatigue, maybe it's already set in. But, I'm going to ride this wave as long as it's available. But the idea is that we're so familiar with these narratives that I was able to sort of harvest from them. The way the world ends, in my case, yes, there's a super flu, of course. Yes, there's nuclear apocalypse to follow, of course. That's almost irrelevant, though. I gloss over that. The way the world ends doesn't matter. The way the world is reborn matters. So this description of the way the world ends, it's just the key in the door in order for yourself, already familiar with these narratives, to enter into mine. I'm a map maker, and when I say that, I'm not being literal. I make maps of my stories in advance of writing them. And I have this office off with a closet off of it, and the previous owner of my house was a hobby photographer, so it's a dark room, this closet. And maybe it's appropriate that I use the dark room as my idea factory. I tack up to the wall conversations overheard in bars or cocktail parties at literary festivals. I got some good stuff last night. I tack up their images. I tack up their maps. So my kids have a Melissa and Doug art easel, and I'll rip off like a 10-foot scroll, and I'll tack it up on the wall of my dark room. My dark room looks a little bit like a serial killer's den, with all these strings attaching everything. And anyways, I make these maps, and here's a little bit how it works. I'll create these sort of character clusters along the left-hand side of the scroll, almost like Wikipedia entries about the characters. And once I figure out who they are, I figure out what they want. And once I figure out what they want, I'm able to put obstacles in the way of their desire. I'm like a cruel god in that way. And that's when I have the first stirrings of plot. So across this scroll, you have like these character sketches, and sometimes I'll actually cartoon them. And then you have these threads moving across the scroll. And what I'll do is I'll step back, because I usually have multiple threads, multiple characters. And I'll start to do this almost, almost like an orchestrated sense of the writing. I'll put upticks and downticks. If a scene, for example, is a set-piece moment, it's a moment of high action, it's a moment of crescendo, then I'll put an uptick. If it's a moment where the characters are in repose, thinking about something, looking out the breeze, looking out the window as the breeze stutters the tulips, downtick. Actually, I've never written that scene. I hope to never write that scene. But I have upticks, downticks, and when I step back from it, it's almost like sheet music, the way I'm figuring out how the chapters will break. Because I want that variation, that modulation. The idea that you want it to look like a cardiogram or a seismograph. I call it the suspensometer. And you want your suspensometer to look like Colorado, not Iowa. So here I am making these maps, and one of the things I was thinking about when I wrote this book was the types of narratives I was appropriating. One of which was the quest narrative. I love quests. I was already talking about The Stand and The Road and Swan Song, or the Journals of Lewis and Clark. I was, think about the Dark Tower series by Stephen King as well. Think about The Lord of the Rings. I mean, I'm so nerdy that the wrap on my phone is a map of Middle-earth. To make matters worse, my ringtone is the Game of Thrones soundtrack. Some of you are so go ahead, steal my lunch money. So, the quest narrative I've always loved, but quest narratives are problematic because they're so often episodic. Right? You have Huck and Jim on the raft. They go down the river. They get off the raft. Hijinks ensue. They get on the raft. They go down the river. They get off the raft. Hijinks ensue. It's how Heart of Darkness works as well. That's a little bit how The Road works as well. And as a result of that, you'd think that getting from point A to point Z there'd be enough thrust, enough propulsion to that. But road trip narratives tend to kind of lack momentum. So one of the things I was thinking about was how to antidote that. And I did a number of different things to antidote that. But one was I crushed the story together with another type of narrative that I'll talk about in just a second. But I thought that I would read just a taste of the quest itself. So here they are, advancing off into the Deadlands. They reach the edge of town, but before they head into the open country, they ride through a dozen pyramids, each one a heap of blackened bones. What must be hundreds of bodies heaved there and splashed with gasoline and lit with a match in the hope that the fire might stop the flu. They ride through cars whose tires have rotted away like black socks. They ride through school buses full of skeletons. They ride past fallen barns bordered by silos that look like the missiles that once fell from the sky. They ride past what were once fields, now sandy barrens interrupted by dead cattle, their ribbed impressions like the roots or tubers that failed to take purchase. There is no trail to follow, so they make their own. They ride in fear of what lies before them and what lies behind. They ride in pain, but they know pain already, or they would not have come, so they ride through the pain, in the hope that it will one day lessen. And when night comes, they ride still, following the stars, trying not to worry about what might await them in the dark. They ride through the night. Lewis wakes with a start when his horse lurches beneath him, sliding down a steep grade, and he wakes again in time to jerk his head away from a branch clawing toward him like a hand. And only when dawn breaks behind them, and the sun rolls across the empty blue bowl of the sky, and chases the shadows to the corners of the earth, and glares furiously down at them, do they stop to rest at last. And so that's the quest, right? The quest of Lewis and Clark, this passage across this destroyed country. So to give a little bit more context before I talk about the other narrative I was thinking about when constructing this book, here you have St. Louis. St. Louis believes itself to be the last outpost of humanity. St. Louis has survived because they have built a wall, they've fortified a perimeter around the downtown of cars stacked one upon the other, mortared and rusted together. And because of an autocratic, fear-mongering government, they have maintained control. They've survived. And all the Deadlands around them are an irradiated desert. So, in this in this place, you have a cast of characters. And you have Lewis and Clark, most notably. And Lewis is, I mean, they were an odd couple in life, but I exaggerated that. So Lewis is even more studious, even more scholarly, even more prone to depressive episodes. And two, he is, well, I thought about magic systems a lot when writing this. I know that's a really nerdy thing to say. But I was researching magic systems. And think about the Lord of the Rings. Gandalf is a terrible wizard. I love Gandalf, but terrible wizard. You know, every once in a while he shows up. Usually he's not even there when needed. But he shows up and he like makes a big light or some noise. He has fireworks. Otherwise, what is this guy doing? You don't understand the magic. But if you read a book like Patrick Rothfuss's The Name of the Wind, which is fantastic if you haven't read it, he goes through, he's in the magician's point of view, and he is describing the magic in such a way that biochemically you almost feel as though you could weave a spell yourself by the time you finish that novel. And so I was trying to do something like that. I was researching, dorky as this is, magic systems. And so the idea is that Lewis is a bit of a magician, a bit of a wizard. And if you think about what we have right now, if we have 1,000 books on our tablet, if we have, you know, the ability to build a human in a laboratory, if we have the ability to fly across the world in a few hours, I mean, that's a kind of magic. And in the absence of this magic, this technology, another kind of technology, more elemental, will take its place. So that's the Lewis character. And on the converse of him, he is Clark, and I've made her a woman, and she's a rogue. She's sort of like the Kirk to his Spock. So they're the odd couple at the heart of this. And then I have various other characters, including a fear-mongering leader and such. And this cues into like the other kind of narrative I was thinking about. The quest narrative and the fishbowl scenario. Stephen King is great with fishbowl scenarios. Think about Under the Dome, most obviously. If you've read it or if you've seen the TV show. Here's a town, and an invisible dome appears over it one day. Or look at the Langoliers, or look at The Mist. In The Mist, you have a grocery store and a supernatural mist surrounds it, in which lurk monsters. Or look at The Green Mile, or look at The Shawshank Redemption. In these fishbowl scenarios, you have a trapped set of characters. And it's a pressure cooker environment. And so certain elements of their personalities are exacerbated by this pressure when it comes to everything from courage to rage to lust to religious fanaticism, and it becomes like a social experiment. So I have the quest narrative, and then I have the fishbowl scenario. The problem with fishbowl scenarios is that they get boring because they're so claustrophobic if you write about them at length. Fishbowl scenarios are almost always novellas or short stories. So I'm thinking of Lauren Groff's Delicate Edible Birds as being one of my favorite examples of this. Fantastic book, fantastic title story. But it's a short story. So I have the quest narrative, and once I reach a moment of physical or emotional peril, what I do is I go into white space, and then I'll have a line like, "Meanwhile, back at the sanctuary," which is what I refer to St. Louis as. Or if I'm at the sanctuary and things are going bad, I'll have a line like, "Meanwhile, back on the Lewis and Clark expedition." And it's so frustrating, right? But as an author, you have to be manipulative. Emotionally manipulative. And I learned this trick from Law & Order. Right, you're watching the detectives, and they're wandering through an alley, and they hear a noise, and they sweep their flashlights toward it, and, it's just a rat. But then the rat, it turns out, is crawling up a leg. And then the flashlight beam rises up and finds the chest and finds the body, the face, and it's not just a body, it's the body of the star witness. Dun dun! Commercial break for Cialis. And that's kind of the way I'm treating chapters. So, here's a story too about an anecdote about the way that I'm thinking about suspense, the way that I'm thinking about manipulating you. The way that I'm thinking about making you want to turn a page. So I've got a friend named Darren, and when I met Darren in high school, this is the first thing he said to me. Now, if you know the answer to this joke, don't say the punchline. But he said to me, "Hi, my name's Darren. Do you know how to make a tissue dance?" And I said, "No." And this is what Darren would ask everybody that he ever met. "How do you make a tissue dance?" Apparently when Darren was in 5th grade, he was at Disney World, and he was waiting in line, drinking a slushie, a roller coaster ahead of him, when a guy came out of the crowd, grabbed him by the shoulder, and said, "Hey, kid, you know how to make a tissue dance?" And Darren was like, "No." And the guy retreated into the crowd. And Darren was like, "That's weird." And kept going forward. He finished his slushie and tossed it aside. As he was about to get on the roller coaster, the guy appeared once more. "Hey, kid, you know how to make a tissue dance?" Darren was like, "No!" But at that point, he was locked into the roller coaster, and he started to go up, and he was doing the flipping about and swirling and looping and not able to enjoy himself, because when he would look down on the crowd below, he could see the guy watching him. And he gets off the roller coaster, and he runs out into the crowd, and the guy's nowhere to be found. And so this becomes like a quest for Darren. He wants to know how to make a tissue dance so badly. He feels like the secret to the universe somehow lies in the response to this question. How do you make a tissue dance? Keep in mind this is before Google. So everybody he meets, he asks, "How do you make a tissue dance?" I'm working at an athletic club when I'm in high school. And it's one of those athletic clubs where everybody's rich and named Tad, and they wear boat shoes. And I do different things. You know, I do the lawn maintenance. I fix the machines. I'm in the locker room picking up towels. I'm in the locker room picking up towels one day when I hear, "Hey, Tad, I've got a good one for you. How do you make a tissue dance?" And I dropped the towels. And I heard the answer. And just to let you know what kind of an SOB I am, for the next 4 months I held this knowledge over Darren. And I admit our friendship suffered because of it. And we were out on Lake Billy Chinook saying goodbye, as all high schoolers do, you know, having that last hurrah before we all headed off to college. Water skiing, and Darren was doing his thing, you know, he was behind the boat with the tow rope. And I figured, why not now? Why not now? And so I yelled out, "How do you make a tissue dance?" And you could tell by the widening of his eyes that he knew it was time at last. How do you make a tissue dance? You put a little boogie in it. At this moment, Darren released the tow rope, and the waves swallowed him up, with a look of utter disappointment on his face. Maybe similar to the disappointment you're feeling right now. Stephen King says that the most essential moment in any horror story is when the character hears a noise behind a door. Could be the door to an attic, could be the door to a basement. Hear a noise behind the door and they approach it, and they reach for the knob. Now when the knob is turned, when the door is flung open, whatever is on the other side of it is irrelevant. The character will scream, but that scream is often followed by laughter. Because whatever is there is not as bad as you imagined. Right? What does everybody say at the end of Jaws? Shark looks fake. It was so much more interesting when it was just a fin or a shadowy surge beneath the water. Right? The end is always somewhat disappointing because of how things have been built up. And that's how fiction works. Like, it's all about holding things tantalizingly out of reach. So I'm thinking about this when I'm reading books, too. I was thinking about secrets. I was thinking about troubles and how to sprinkle them, dole them out across an entire narrative, especially when writing something epic. So when I wrote Red Moon, what I did was I looked at a book that everybody was reading at the time, a book that was big, and yet people were turning the pages so swiftly it made a breeze on their face. And it used to be that you could tell what everybody was reading. You know, I'd walk through an airport and I'd spy on what people were reading. You can't do that anymore because of Kindles. It's like I guess it's because everybody is reading 50 Shades of Grey. And they don't want you to know. It's like the brown paper bag over the liquor bottle. But I was walking through the Denver airport, and it was like a highlighter smear of yellow. Everybody was reading the same book in the concourse, and it was The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo. And I don't think that's the greatest book by any means, but I read it twice, and the second time I mapped it out. And one of the things I was doing was I was tacking all of the troubles and the secrets in it. And what I would do is here's Blomkvist, and he's this embattled reporter. And he has all of these problems. He has professional problems, he has financial problems, he has romantic problems, he has problems of physical peril as he pursues this case against the serial killer. And then you have Elizabeth Salander, and she has her own problems. And what I would do is I would put a different colored sticky note on each of these problems. Like a pink one for this, a yellow one for that, a neon green one for this. By the time I got to the end of the book, it looked peacocked with feathers. And there was almost a mathematical formula to it. Like whatever came up on page 25, again came up on page 75, again came up on page 125, again came up on page 150. This juggling. I began to think of it as a dance, like the dance of the flaming chainsaws. That's what each of these secrets is, or these troubles is a flaming chainsaw. And it goes into the author's hand, and as it goes out of reach, you think, what about that? And then this other flaming chainsaw comes in and distracts you, and you're about, what about that? And here comes this other one, and it's just this constant dance until they all fall at once toward the end. So, secrets. I opened up this book with a secret. Who is this girl? Born on a winter night, in perilous circumstances. There is a sense of her as a savior, and that's what she might be for this infant America, this new America. So, I'm going to read just this opening scene and then quit. So I hope you have some smart or smart-ass questions to hurl at me after this. She knows there is something wrong with the baby. She has known from the very beginning. First, there was the nausea that left her bedridden for weeks, dizzy and barely able to eat, chewing on cucumbers, filling up on spring water. Then the surges in temper, the blackening headaches, and finally, a stillness inside of her when there should have been movement, a fluttering like the tail of a trout. That's what her friends told her, so that she would twist her body and prod her belly until the child readjusted itself, assuring her it was there. It was alive. They live in a windowless cabin high in the mountains. Others live not far away, some near a spring-fed stream, others cut back in the woods. Together they form a village of sorts, happily isolated, wary of outsiders and change, fearful of the stories told by their elders, stories of an illness that causes a bloody cough and blistering fevers, stories of missiles raining from the sky and cratering the earth, stories of scavengers with meaty breath and teeth filed into points. Outside, the snow is knee-deep. Before long, it will be taller than her husband, taller than the cabin, and every day they will need to shovel a wide passage from the door in case they should be trapped, shrouded. Sometimes she dreams the child is not a child. It is a grub, fat and white and segmented with black eyes. It is a beast with tiny yellow fangs and tiny yellow claws. Its body covered in fur as sleek as an otter's. Or maybe it is a nothing, a dark spirit, a possessed vapor, and her body the house it haunts. So she is relieved when she gives the final push and feels a tear, a gush, an emptying, and then the midwife smiles and coos and says, "There now." She cuts the cord with a knife. She carries the child to the table and wipes it clean with a rag. Juliana bunches towels between her legs and watches the child through heavy-lidded eyes. Everything is fine. Everything will turn out all right after all. Then she notices something. The absence of something. The baby is not crying. The baby has not made a sound. The midwife stands over it, the red rag in her hand like a crushed rose. What's the matter? Is it alive? It's alive, isn't it? The midwife nods. Is it all right? The midwife looks at her, looks at the baby with a mouth that quivers with words she cannot express. What is it? A boy? A girl. What's wrong? Her voice comes out a choked whisper when she says, her eyes. She drapes a blanket around the child and hurries to the bed in a rush to be rid of it. Juliana accepts the child and tears away the wrappings. Her face, splotchy and wrinkled and coned from birth, looks like any baby's face, but her eyes, they are wide open, seemingly lidless, with no whiteness to them. all pupil, no iris, as if splashed full of ink. For now, the windwife says that for now the child must eat. She thumbs down the baby's chin and plays its mouth along her nipple while Juliana massages her breast and brings from it a thick, yellowish bead of colostrum. The baby nods toward the taste but will not latch on. She keeps pulling away to stare at Juliana. And it may be a trick of the light, the cabin so dim, but the baby's large eyes appear to her somehow sorrowful. Juliana struggles to hold the baby's head in place. She does not believe the baby should be strong enough to do so, but she is. Arching her back and twisting her head to study her mother's face. Thanks. Thank you. So if you have any questions about the book, the business, or whatever, I'm happy to answer. Yeah, Stephen.
I was wondering if you might give us a few bars of Goodnight Moon.
I had a request for Goodnight Moon. In the great green room, there was a telephone, and I've already forgotten it. The quiet old lady whispering, "Hush," the bowl of mush. The scariest page of all is, of course, Goodnight Nobody. It's just a blank page, post-apocalyptic children's literature. But yeah, I did for Grey Wolf Press. I did a reading of Goodnight Moon, and it's online, and if you play it, your computer might burst into flames. Any other questions, though? Yes, sir, Keith.
I'm curious. As you're writing, do you hear it the way you speak it? Do you hear it the same pacing, cadence, or...
So Keith's question is, do I hear the story in my voice as I write it? And I guess I do. I read everything aloud several times a day. I go back. It's part of my revision process. And if it doesn't sound right on my tongue, if it tastes foul in some way, I change it. I am thinking about cadences. I am thinking about the musicality of it all. And the thing is that even now, I'm changing things at the podium. Sometimes clumsily. Like I'll come across, an adverbial slot that I think was unnecessary, and I'll try to change it mid-sentence. I skipped over 3 sentences at least when I was reading just now, and added in a few qualifiers, and yeah. So I don't know. There's just something about putting something in a drawer for a while. Even if you put it in a drawer for 6 months, you see the warts on the face of the thing that you need to sand and scissor away. But even now, however many months later, more than a year later, I'm finding more things that I find problematic, and a lot of that has to do with just the sound of writing. Yes. So when did I start writing? I wanted to be Harrison Ford when I was a kid. Han Solo would have been great, but I really wanted to be Indiana Jones particularly, and I pursued archaeology for some time. I had the fedora, I had the whip, I had the leather satchel. But after going on several digs with the University of Oregon, with the Oregon Museum of Science and Industry, that dream began to dissolve, and I had an existential crisis. I didn't know what I wanted to do. As everybody in their early 20s has an existential crisis, right? And I went to work for Glacier National Park, and I was the gardener at Glacier National Park, which is sort of a curious thing to be. And I was thinking a lot about bears that summer, because the first thing I heard when I got off the train from the ranger who picked me up was that you're going to be the only gardener because the other one just got eaten. He was eaten by a grizzly. And her 2 cubs. So I was thinking about these bears as I was mowing the lawn and looking up on the hillside at the 14, 15, 17 of them trundling from huckleberry thicket to huckleberry thicket. My roommate was stalked by the same mother and cubs for 10 miles. I was I was writing in a journal for the first time a lot about bears. Not just about bears, though, but images I was encountering or conversations that I overheard. And this became fodder for my first published novel, The Wild End. So even early on, when I was still imagining myself as Indiana Jones, I was almost in training to be a novelist because I was living a fantasy life. But it was only then when I was actually putting words on the page and pushing them around and imagining how they might be built into stories that I truly thought, maybe I've got a chance. Maybe I should try this out. And this was encouraged by, I was very interested in a waitress at the lodge at Glacier National Park, and I was writing her all these lascivious love letters and poems, and she said to me one night, "You should be a writer." And I said, "Okay." All in an attempt to impress a pretty girl. I ended up marrying her, so it worked out. Yeah.
The techniques that you talked about that you use to structure your story, like the uptakes and the downtakes and all this kind of stuff. Create those?
So he's asking about the way I'm orchestrating the narrative, the orchestration of suspense. Yeah, I'm absolutely thinking deliberately about, let's say, a set piece moment. Like, how can I create this big crescendo moment? You know, if you think about The Untouchables, which is like the height of cheesy action in the 80s. There's that one scene in The Untouchables that is actually drawn from Sergei Eisenstein's film Battleship Potemkin. But it's the staircase shootout sequence, right? And it takes almost 10 minutes to play out. But you have Kevin Costner's a Fed, and he's going after Al Capone's gang, and this big shootout happens in the Chicago train station. And in the middle of it all, there's this baby pram thumping down the stairs in slow motion. And I'm thinking about, like, where do you place that moment in a narrative? You always place that moment in your inciting incident, right? Like in a screenplay, the inciting incident is page 15 or minute 15. In a novel, it's a little more loose. But like the introduction to trouble and the resolution to trouble, that moment in The Untouchables is one of the, sort of towards the end of the film, one of the resolution moments. Like those moments are spread out. And you have to have them in the second act as well, because the second act always has like this slog, this narrative slog. So that's the moment, like with the dojo fight sequence in The Matrix. That's the moment in Eastern Promises where there's the naked knife fight in the steam room. If you haven't seen Eastern Promises, it's pretty. That scene alone justifies the rental. That's the moment in The Birds when she's attacked in the phone booth, right? So you have these carefully orchestrated, these big moments at certain junctures in their narrative, but you have to have slow moments, like thoughtful moments on either side of them. William Kittredge says, the key to storytelling design is tell a story, have some thoughts about it. Tell a story, have some thoughts about it. And that's sort of the way the up-down goes, the peaks, valleys. Yeah. Turning off my mind and going to sleep. I mean, when I tend to write in the morning. So I put the kids on the school bus. I sit down at 7 a.m. I write until 3:30 when they get home. And then I'm a dad. So at night I tend to be reading or watching Game of Thrones. And I do have a problem with insomnia. And sometimes I'll get up in the middle of the night to write. So yeah, I do feel like my brain is sometimes on overdrive, imaginative overdrive. But that affects me even in the everyday world. I mean, I'm a terrible driver because I'll be, going along the interstate and suddenly, I see this water tower, like turn into some sort of like tripod, this metal spider, and it starts going across the road and picking up cars and hurling them. And here I am getting honked at as I veer into oncoming traffic as I imagine this. So there's always that issue of living in too many worlds at once. Yeah.
Talk about the difference between writing novels and comics.
The difference between writing novels and comics. I'm pretty new to comics. I've written, as you mentioned, the 2 issues of Detective Comics with Batman, and now I'm taking over Green Arrow. So my Green Arrow run begins this June. The prologue, the primer issue, is already online through DC for free. And what I'm learning about comics is I've been a lifelong comics reader, but I'm only now really analyzing the form. And it's so strict. Like you have 22 pages or 20 pages or 18 pages, depending on the comic. And you have to have 5 to 7 scenes, maximum. And you have to do this, and this in every issue. I mean, every panel, you're carefully thinking about as though you were a director, as though you were a costumer, as though you were a lighting technician. as you're doing everything a filmmaker might do, and you're also writing that dialogue and also writing that narrative description. So that it seems like in an offhand sort of way, oh, comics are so fun. Some people think of them as sort of silly, as something that's just like a passing entertainment. But there's such a science to the way in which they're written, and I think it's making me a better novelist and a better screenwriter writing them. So we're out of time, but thanks everybody for coming out.